Well, let's talk a little bit about the book of Daniel. So if you have your Bible, you're going to want to be in the Old Testament. You're going to be about 2/3 of the way through. Daniel is a prophet, but here's the kind of the funny thing about Daniel as the prophet. In the Torah, which is or in the Tanakh, excuse me, let me slow down. In the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew compilation of scriptures, Daniel is actually listed as a wisdom book. So it would be there with Job, Proverbs, the Psalms, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs. So it would be over there. In the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that would have been the one that like Jesus, Paul, Apollos, the New Testament people would have primarily used. It was moved over to the prophets. And the reason why is because Daniel's kind of split down the middle. You don't really know what to do with Daniel. The first 6 chapters of Daniel are all basically history. And then the last 6 or so chapters of Daniel are pretty much all prophecy. So Daniel really stands out as a hybrid book. What happens in Daniel, though, is incredibly important because of how long the prophecies in Daniel span. So Daniel probably lived well into his 80s. And if you figure he was captured and deported in his early teens, Daniel chapter 1, you can read the story there. We're not going to go through all of the stories in the lion's den and the Daniel fast, which is basically just pomegranates and lentils in case you're wondering what you're allowed to eat on the Daniel fast. That's one of my favorite things. People are like, I'm on a Daniel fast, so I'm eating corn chips. I'm like, they didn't have corn in the Middle East. I don't know how to tell you that. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. You'll find out, those of you who aren't quite familiar with how I teach, one of my favorite things to do is absolutely destroy people's illusions about how great. Anyway, all right. Wait till we get to Christmas. Okay, let's move on. So let's talk about the context of Daniel. One of the biggest things you have to remember is that the book of Daniel, and this is your first blank for the night, is set within the context of the 6th century exile. The 6th century exile. One of the best things you can do to really help you unpack and open up Scripture for yourself is really get a handle on the timelines of Scripture. And there are certain critical dates that are absolutely necessary to understanding how things lay out. In fact, I may be able to send something out over the next week, but really these linchpin dates. So you have sort of, the way to look at biblical history, if you want to, is there is sort of the epic stage of biblical history, what you would even call prehistory, where things aren't really told in terms of history, but they're more told as poetry and epics and sagas, right? So you have these epics that start out, the epic of the creation, the epic of the fall in the garden, the epic of the Tower of Babel, the epic of Noah. And time is very fluid and it's not really precise and generations come and go. From the epics, then you move into what are called the sagas. And the sagas are those first few families kind of leading up to Ishish around Moses going into and getting them out of the promised land. So you have the saga of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, then the saga of Joseph, and then it picks up in the book of Exodus. After those sagas, we finally get to history. And the reason why is because in the ancient world, as we've talked about, they didn't pay attention to dates. It's when they start interacting with other nations like Egypt that did pay attention to dates, that we can start to sort of cross-confirm dates in the Bible. One of the first dates that we find is around 702-ish BC, if I'm doing that off the top of my head, so please do not quote me, and I really shouldn't have even said it out loud. But that has to do with the announcement of a certain king from Assyria, and he's confirmed both in the Bible and in ancient history. And boom, the rest of the world and the story of Israel kind of click together at that point. If you're looking for a rough time frame for David, that's around 1000-ish BC. There are all these timelines. But one of the most critical dates is right in and around the 7th and 6th century BC. And that's when the series of conquests come. So first, the northern kingdom, which is called Israel, is conquered by Assyria, Sennacherib, and all those dates that I just mentioned. And then several decades later, Babylon comes, completely conquers Assyria, comes up and over, completely conquers Jerusalem, completely conquers Judah, and begins the deportation. Those are the stories that are told in Daniel, Ezekiel, partially in Jeremiah, partially in Isaiah. That's the stories that come out. It's in that these apocalyptic prophecies really start to kind of pop up. Now, there are prophecies talking about in the latter days, but stuff really gets weird when they get to Babylon. And the reason why is because Babylon's a weird place. And what we often confuse is this idea that when we read these prophecies, pay attention who they are to. So one of the things that what we find is that as we're reading Daniel and Ezekiel particularly, you'll find that it doesn't sound Bible-y. What I mean by that is the animals are all different and the colors are wrong and it's all this kind of stuff. And the reason why is because Yahweh, speaking through these exiled prophets, are using the images and the symbols of a different kingdom. So he's not using Canaanite symbols, which would have been familiar to everyone in Israel and Judea. He's using the symbols of the place that they are bound, if you will, the place that they are exiled. You say, well, that's kind of interesting. I never knew that. If you think about it, he also did the same thing when they were bound and exiled, in a form of exile in Egypt. The 10 plagues are all defeats of the Egyptian pantheon, the deities of Egypt, and there's all this kind of stuff. Okay. So that being said, what we do have, and this is going to excite some of you, because I have to eat a little crow tonight. Okay? Crows are not symbols in the Bible. One of my hard and fast rules when I talk about studying the Bible is I say numbers don't mean a lot until they do. And so finally they do. Because in Daniel and Ezekiel and Isaiah, we get a lot of numbers. So let's spend just a moment talking about symbols and numbers in the ancient world, okay? So here's what I want us to understand. Numbers, animals, nations, and other symbols are not important because they have power. They are important because we give them power. Let me say that again. These numbers are not highlighted because they have an inherent power. They have a meaning because of the symbolism we as humanity gave them. Okay? For example, everyone's favorite, the number 7, right? So everyone says, oh, the number 7. And the number of 7 is the number, and what we say is, we'll say it something like, well, the number 7 is the number of perfection. Or the number 7 is the number of God. Or the number 7 is the number of completion. But the number 4 is also a number of completion, and so is the number 10. You see what I'm saying here. What happens is then people will say, oh, well, if I want to have a perfect miracle, I need to pray for it 7 times. And what we've done is we said there's something magic about 7. And that is, what the Bible has a word for that, and that word is witchcraft. Right? Rather than saying, collectively the number 7 carried a symbol, a meaning of God's completeness, of his perfection, of his wholeness, of shalom, because he created the world in 7 days. There are 7 days in a lunar calendar. There is a sense in which 7 means something. So we'll use the number 7 to get us to pay attention to these themes. That's very different than saying there is something about the number 7 that is perfect and special. I need to have 7 kids. We need to work here for 7 years. Like, we do all this stuff. And without knowing it, we cross over into astrology and witchcraft before we even realize what's going on. And people do it all the time. They do it all the time, right? Especially with 7. We do it in the modern world with the number 13. I'm going to get on a plane on Friday morning. There will not be a 13th row. I will stay at a hotel. There will not be a 13th floor. And people say, why is 13 so mysterious? Why is it so wicked? Why is 13 so evil? And we say, oh, the witching hour, that's 1 o'clock in the morning because it's 1 after 12. And we'll say, why is 13? Because it was past what we could count. Okay, I'll walk you through that one. 10, 11, 12, and then 13. And Friday the 13th, people will say, oh, it's crazy in emergency rooms on Friday the 13th, or it's crazy when there's a full moon. We do all this stuff. You know why 13th is scary? Because it was on a Friday the 13th when the French king killed all of the Templar Knights. That's why. If he'd have done it on the 14th, we'd all be freaked out by 14. I'm serious. There's nothing about 13 that is this, oh, it's this mystic thing, and I got to have 13, and I'll put out 13 candles, and I will manifest my husband, or whatever that is that we think we do. And you say, well, I don't do that. I'm a Christian. We have to be very careful that the things we say are this, they aren't that, they mean that. And if you let your mind chew on that, those are two very different things. So when I talk about some of the numbers tonight that we're getting into, you have to see them as symbols, maybe even more than a symbol, but they are not inherently mystical or powerful. Because if they are, then that means we can manipulate the numbers, and if we manipulate the numbers, we get what we want from God, and that is, in fact, witchcraft. So all the stuff that we see with Bible codes and Hebrew codes and counting the letters across, and this letter means this, and this letter means this, and 7, and well, 7 is because of the word that sounds like the Hebrew word for 7, which is sebum. Like there's all the stuff that we go in there. We have to remember that at one point it was just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's nice. So we have to be very, very careful with that. That's the level of comfort at which I'm going to get into numbers, okay? All right, if you disagree with me, I encourage you to start your own class. All right. Now, the other thing about these symbols is they are important because of where Daniel is written. Daniel is written in Babylon, and it is written primarily, the prophecies in Daniel are written to Babylonian rulers. So God is using their symbols to speak to them. So what we'll often do is we'll say, well, what did this mean to the Jews? That's actually secondary in a book like Daniel, in a book like Ezekiel. It's secondary. You have to discover what did these symbols, nations, imagery, substances, minerals, like all this stuff, what did it mean to the Babylonians first? Because it can't mean more, it can't mean less, I should say. It can't mean less to them than it does to us. It starts with what it meant to them. Now, it can take on meaning, as we'll see a little bit later, but ultimately, when these things were first uttered, they would have evoked symbols within the current context, and they would have meant something. Okay? Certain numbers, animals, numbers, and other images draw the reader's attention and provide hints to greater meanings. Ultimately, these numbers are there, symbols, numbers, images, all that are there to say, pay attention to this. And some are a long time, some are a long series of perfection, a long series of power, a long series. People really get into the math here. They really do. And it's impressive. Trust me, I've been reading stuff, and I'm good with math, I'll be honest with you, and this stuff was crazy. Like, I didn't take this in high school. This was not math that I knew about. And they'll draw circles, and they get into the Fibonacci sequence and the golden mean, and before I know it, I'm sitting here and I'm doing advanced calculus just to find out what my, what God wants me to eat for dinner tomorrow. But we get into that. And if you say, well, that sounds weird, if you think about it, that's all really astrology is. We're going to move the stars and the suns together, and we're going to play this sort of cosmic game with all of these things. And what we've done is we've sort of missed out on the point of God saying, if any man lacks wisdom, let him ask God for it, who gives freely. God says, draw close to me, and I'll draw close to you. See, we don't have to do all of this extra stuff. And I just say that because one of the things that we talked about with apocalyptic literature is one of the things that it can be is distracting. There's inherent distraction to it. And I don't want us to get distracted. I want us to say when Daniel saw this, and by the way, you say, well, what did he see? He saw some weird stuff. And I believe that is what he saw. But it would have spoken something to him, and from that would have come a greater meaning. Okay? So, let's go ahead and move forward. There are your blanks. All right, is this my picture? All right, so let's talk about eschatology in Daniel. Let's talk about eschatology in Daniel. It's exciting. All sorts of crazy stuff. All right. Let me get here to Daniel. No, that's Ezekiel. All right. Okay. All right, let's see what we got here. Is this the... Okay, how many of you have ever seen something like this? The dispensational chart, right? Some of us grew up on these. You'd come to church, and this big chart would be behind you, corner to corner on the stage, right? I have a whole book of these. It's crazy. And so what it does is, we'll get to this statue here in a second, but there you've got beasts, you've got everything. And so what you had is a school, if you will, of interpretive theory called dispensationalism, and that was that God divided all of human history, divided up into little sections, and God dispenses a little bit of grace for each one. And it's very systematic and it's very structured. A guy named Charles Scofield and then a guy named Darby were some of the first ones to come up with it in the late 19th century, the late 1800s. And it's really fascinating and interesting. But anyway, remember earlier I thought, well, what do you think of when you think of talking about the apocalypse or the book of, this is it, this is me. This is what my brain goes to. You say the book of Revelation, and I think of this weird statue of Nebuchadnezzar lying on its side, right? That's where I go to. This famous image for some of us is from the book of Daniel, okay? So let's get into it and let's talk a little bit. Let's talk first in the first vision, the sort of apocalyptic vision that comes out is in Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2, verses 31 through 45. I am not going to read all of this, don't worry, okay? The essence of it is this. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he does this really funny game, because he says, hey, why can't, so it's after the all this stuff, and it's Daniel's faithfulness and all this kind of stuff. And so Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and none of his spiritual advisors, none of his soothsayers, none of his mages, his magicians, no one can tell him what his dream was. And I love this, because he's like, if you were really all that powerful, and they're like, tell us your dream, O king, and we'll tell you what it means. He's like, if you were any good, I wouldn't even have to tell you my dream. That's really smart. It's like, if you go to a psychic, they should say, I've been expecting you. Like if I wouldn't go to a psychic, but I went in and like, oh, I'm surprised to see you. I'm like, then you're horrible at your job, and I need to leave. I shouldn't go, because it's dabbling in witchcraft. But anyway, all right, neither here nor there. So he goes and he says, fine, you find me someone that will actually tell me what my dream is, and I'll mention it to him. And Daniel's like, I got this. So Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And he tells him what the dream is. And so he says, okay, here's what you want. He says, don't kill them all. I'll help you out. Here's what happens. Okay, so Daniel chapter 2, verse 31 starts this. You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness. Of exceeding brightness. I love that. Stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold. Its chest and arms were made of silver. Its middle and thighs were bronze. Its legs were iron, and its feet were partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand. It struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them into pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces. They became like the chaff of the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone, the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Okay? So, all you have to do at any point, this is the most awesome thing in the world, is Google Daniel chapter 2 statue, and you will get 1,000 pictures like this. Okay? The even crazier thing are these new, like doll.e, these bots that you just type in, draw me a picture of a statue, and it will give you, anyway, it's crazy. It's crazy out there on the internet, I'm just telling you. There's some wacky stuff going on. All right, so you have a head of gold, you have this arms of silver, the waist here is of bronze, the legs of iron, and then the feet are mixed of iron and clay, and then a stone, I guess that's what this is supposed to be, this stone that looks like the Borg is attacking this statue. Okay, I'm going to introduce you one of the most critical Bible interpretive. This is an absolute rule, and that's this. If the Bible gives you the interpretation of a vision or prophecy, that is exactly what it means. Don't try to outdo the Bible. Okay? And it doesn't happen all the time, but there's a few times. Like, for example, one of my favorite parables, the parable of the sower, and there's all these great imagery in there, and then Jesus says, it means exactly this. I'm not about to go say, well, actually, it could mean this too, because now I'm trying to out-prophesy Jesus, and that's always a bad plan. So what does he say? Well, I'll tell you what. He says it very explicitly, Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold. Okay? From there it says this. Oh boy, I'm getting old. You king, you are the head of gold. Another kingdom of inferior value shall rise after you, silver, another one after you, and so on and so forth. The problem is that he never says what the foot kingdom is. Okay? Now, most historians and biblical scholars tend to agree actually on both sides of the interpretive aisle, pretty straightforward. You have Babylon, you have some version of the Medo-Persian Empire, okay? That's the ones that came after this. So this is like in the Bible, this is Cyrus and Artaxerxes and, these guys. Then after them, you have the Greeks and then maybe the Romans, but who's at the feet? Now, what's really awesome is you can go and someone will tell you exactly what this means. And that's when I get really nervous, because the Bible doesn't tell us. So I saw one today that said, the feet is the Holy Roman Empire. Yes, that might have been true 1,100 years ago, but could it still be true? Has this kingdom even come? But what we have is this. Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel was saying that God told you, Nebuchadnezzar, that you are sitting on the top, and this is critical, of a cycle of history. What I call a cycle of empire. And that there is now, starting with you, Nebuchadnezzar, a cycle of empires. And empires will rise and empires will fall. And at the end of every empire, there is something from the outside. And this is what it says. You know what the stone that becomes the mountain is? It says this. And in the days, it says this. The toes of the feet, and in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. This is verse 44. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms, bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Now, what we often do is we'll read this. If you look at the sketch that I put up there earlier, everything happens in sequence. This doesn't happen till this doesn't happen till this. But if you pay close attention to the text, in his interpretation of this prophecy, Daniel says, in the days of all of these kings, there is another kingdom growing. There is another kingdom on the outside. Of all of these kings, there is another kingdom growing. And that kingdom will topple all kingdoms. That kingdom will last forever. That kingdom, in fact, it says that this stone becomes a mountain that covers the whole earth. And so we can get lost in the symbols and the power, and why is this gold? Because gold is nicer than silver, and silver is nicer than bronze. And Daniel, God was kind of saying, Nebuchadnezzar, you're about as good as it's ever going to get. And then from there, they get Cyrus, although Cyrus was the first to be called the Great. And then from there, you get Alexander. And then from there, it's like Nero. And it really does kind of decline, actually, if you pay attention to it. Because, you had a couple of good Caesars, but beyond that, all the Romans really did was steal stuff from the Greeks, and all the Greeks really did was steal stuff from the Persians, and all the Persians really did was barely take over the Medias, and all the Media really did was take over stuff from Babylon. And to be honest, Babylon stole everything from Assyria. So if you really want to get to it, Assyria's tops, everyone else is just trying. That is the history of the world. Congratulations. All right. Okay. So what does all this mean? Well, we can spend a lot of time talking about why this medal for that. Why this? What are the 10 toes? That was my favorite one. What are the 10 toes? Because if there's 2 feet, there must be 10 toes. And if there's 10 toes, that must be 10 kingdoms. And there's 10 nations in the European Union, therefore. And boom, now we're here. And that's what we do. We try to fill in these gaps because we long to know. Instead of sitting back and saying, what did God say first? God said there is a cycle of empire. And no matter what that cycle is, there is another kingdom behind it that is always growing, that is always moving, that is always there. And there have been times where that kingdom has interrupted and torn down all kinds of empires. And there will be a time when all those empires are torn down and the legacy is shattered. It'll be like they were never here. Now, imagine being a Babylonian king. You think essentially you're a god. You think that you've built a kingdom that's going to last forever. And this guy comes along, and in a few chapters he's going to say, it's barely going to last 70 years. That these cycles of empire are always there. And it says this, in verse 45, Daniel says this to Nebuchadnezzar, he says, a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. Let's rewind to last week. What are our time frames? Before, now, soon, and later. The later days, the day after the day. Daniel's still invoking God. Again, this is a prophecy given to a Babylonian king, and Daniel's essentially saying, my God, who's a greater God than any of yours, Nebuchadnezzar, is allowing you to see this. He's allowing you to see the cycles of time. He's allowing you to see how all this is going to play out. And honestly, Nebuchadnezzar, he's put you at the top for some reason. So one of the biggest themes that starts coming out consistently in the book of Daniel is this cycle of empire. And another theme that comes out consistently, as we see here, is the hidden kingdom. That there is another kingdom always growing. Now imagine, you're hearing this and you're in exile. You're a Jew and somehow you've come across a copy of this. You have no land, you have no law, you have no king, you have no temple. You're slaves to another. And there's a message coming out that says, but there is a kingdom being born. There's a kingdom rebuilding. There's a kingdom growing. Do you think you're going to care about what statue is made up of what? You don't care about the statue. You care about the rock. And that's what we have to focus on. The statue's fascinating. The statue's interesting. I would love it, by the way. Some of you guys that can grow really big, bushy, burly beards, will someone please give me a Nebuchadnezzar at some point? I just want to see one of you guys roll up with a big, fat, braided beard. Anyway, all right. I'm just saying, it'd be awesome. But all of this kind of stuff. But this is the real story. The kingdom behind the kingdoms. There's a silent kingdom, a hidden kingdom. And one that, although has no earthly power, is the most powerful force on the planet. Because this is not a kingdom of a few hundreds of, thousands of square miles. This isn't a kingdom of a few mega cities. This isn't a kingdom of massive armies. This is a kingdom that has spread, has and will spread over the entire globe. And after it destroys, becomes that mountain. Okay? So, again, gold typically means Babylon. Depending on which scholar you're listening to, in case you are interested in this, the silver is either the Median/Persians or the Medians or the Persians. I mean, again, this is all interpretive. That means that the bronze is either the Persians or the Greeks. In case you're wondering, why do I need to know all this? Because a lot's going on outside the world, okay? And then down here is either the Greeks or the Romans. And why does this matter? Is because pretty soon we'll start getting into numbers, and when you start picking who's who, now the numbers start moving around, okay? So that's our first one. All right, let's go to the next one. Daniel 7, the four beasts. The four beasts. Oh, boy. Okay. Now, in the first year, this is Daniel chapter 7, verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions. So actually two different things. Dream is asleep. Vision is just kind of walking around, and in case you've ever wondered what the difference is. Okay? Of his head as he lay in bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of this mania. Daniel declared this: I saw in my vision by night, behold, the four winds of heaven. Okay, first big number, 4. 4 typically means like totality in the sense of range, like covering, like it's all-encompassing would be a good word. 4 and 10 tend to be like all-encompassing. Why? Because of the 4 cardinal directions. So if you have 4, it means you're covering a lot of it. Then you get into wind. Almost universally, whenever ancient documents talk about 4 winds, they're talking about a universal strength or power, a global, a worldwide power or strength. So Daniel's saying, I had this vision, and it means to me that there is this worldwide power. And the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. Okay, let's talk a second about the ocean. Israel did not come from the ocean, right? They came from a garden, and then they came from Babylon. And then, so Israel came from the east and went west. Every time somebody showed up in the west and tried to come east, it was really terrifying to the Israelites. So what you will see throughout all of Israel, particularly Israel wisdom literature, like Job, Songs, all that kind of stuff, is that the sea is bad and scary. Scary things happen in the ocean. The Israelis, the Jews, the Hebrews of the ancient world were not a seafaring people. They're like, if we can't see the coast, we're doomed. And so what becomes the sea becomes this massive symbol for darkness and chaos. That's our next theme. So we have the theme of the cycle of the empire. We have the theme of the hidden kingdom. And now we have a new theme that Daniel introduced of the battle between chaos and order. Chaos and order. Say, what do you mean by that, Brian? Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. In other words, creation was chaotic. So all throughout Scripture, you see Yahweh as a God who trends towards wholeness, towards order, towards shalom, towards peace. So foreign gods are often depicted as, if you will, agents of chaos. And that's why the animals that are depicted are powerful, scary, chaotic animals. And he says this, and 4 beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like. Don't undersell the like. Okay? You guys know okay, just real quick, 8th grade English, the difference between a simile and a metaphor. Simile is, a metaphor is like. Okay? It's like a lion. Is it a lion? Who knows? So I had to go on this search. Because I'm like, wait a second, there aren't lions in Israel. Ho ho, I was wrong. There aren't anymore. The Asiatic lion almost went extinct in the 19th century, in the 1800s. It's only found now in India. It's got a smaller head. Its mane doesn't go all the way around. It looks like a lion with like male pattern baldness is what it looks like, okay? So it's like a lion, it looks like a big Amish lion. It's got nothing up here and a big beard, right? It's a little bit smaller, but they had lions. And I just thought that was interesting. Okay. Daniel is shown the throne of heaven and given warning about a kingdom different from other kingdoms. Now, this is not the hidden kingdom. This is a kingdom different from other kingdoms. What we have is the throne room of heaven. 3 big throne room of heaven visions. Isaiah chapter 6, Ezekiel chapter 1, Daniel chapter 7. And they're all roughly the same-ish, right? You've got God, someone up there in Daniel chapter 7. He's called the Ancient of Days. In other words, he's like the oldest of old, which is very interesting because anyway, all right. So he's up there and he's on a throne that could be a chariot or it could be a throne made out of chariot wheels, or it could be a throne with chariot wheels attached to it, or it could be a chariot of fire, but what it isn't is an ancient alien spaceship. Can we all agree that that's not what it is? I don't care what the guy with the crazy hair on the History Channel says, okay? Thrones in the ancient world often either had chariot wheels to them as a sign, or when given sort of these big apocalyptic visions, they were a sign of conquest and victory, okay? By the way, we also know chariots of fire, there's a biblical theme there with Elijah and Elisha and all that kind of stuff. So he has this vision, okay? And that's it. And he's going to warn about this kingdom. So he sees these 4 beasts. Number 1, you have the lion, and the lion has eagle's wings, right? So you have the lion, which is the noblest of creatures, of land creatures, and the eagle, which is the noblest of flying creatures. He'll tell us who it is in a second, but essentially this was not an unusual thing to see in Babylonian mythology. In fact, one of the most famous pictures of something similar to this is what's called the Ishtar Gate in Iraq now. It has a big picture of a lion on it, okay? There's this great German word for it called the Menschenwesen, and the Menschenwesen are weird animals, and there's this whole stuff, and I made the mistake of looking up an academic article on it one time, and now every day I get sent an article about Menschenwesen. All right, okay. So we have a lion, right? And the lion has wings, okay? And then it says this, it came up out of the sea, different from one another. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, which means that it becomes demoted, and it was lifted from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. So Daniel is telling them, I'll get to that in a second, what that means. And behold, there was another beast, a second one, like a bear. And I'm like, well, what kind of bears are there? This little guy is the Syria bear, or the Syrian bear. And he's just a little bear, but he's a deadly bear, because as we all know, Elisha had him eat those kids. All right. But yeah, he's a bear. So what you have essentially are these chaotic animals. And I'll get to something in a second that's also interesting. Okay? The bear was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth and was told, "Arise, devour much flesh." So we know that there is the sense of the 3 is speaking of sort of this divine power within it. It means that it is active. It is this powerful, gnarly animal. After this, I looked and behold like a leopard, and the leopard had 4 wings of a bird on its back, and the beast had 4 heads. So it's a 4-headed, 4-winged leopard. Okay? But look at what it says next. And dominion was given to it. So let's rewind a little bit. Let's start putting our symbology together because it is important. If 4 is the same thing as the 4 winds, now we have a leopard that has 4 heads and 4 wings. It means that this becomes representative of basically a world-conquering empire. That's really what this is. This is an empire that will literally span the known globe. Okay? And then there's this guy. After this, I saw in the night visions. So he had a vision of all 3 of these, and then he had another vision, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with it. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So this is the first introduction of this 10. So we have the 4 with the leopard. We have 4 beasts in total, 4 winds, 4 with the leopard. But now we have this guy. And you want to get weird, Google this guy. And it gets really strange because he's got a little horn up here that has a face. No one knows what it is. It doesn't say. It just doesn't. We don't know if it's a goat, if it's a ram. Well, it's just a big, gnarly beast. There is some precedent for something in Babylon called the Lotan. It's where we get the word Leviathan in the Bible. But God beats the Leviathan too. But it may be that, but it's probably not. Okay? I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. We are being introduced to someone here. And in this beast, out of whatever this beast is, out of his 10 horns, or its 10 horns, one horn pushes other horns out of the way and rises to prominence and begins to speak. But it never becomes a great horn. It's always just a little horn. So Daniel has this vision, then he looks out. And as he looked, it says this: thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. His hair was like pure wool. This is have wisdom and holiness. That's what those white images mean. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fires. A stream of fire issued. You see rivers of flame in all of these epiphanies, meaning judgment and power. 1,000 thousands served him. Okay, now we've gone back into vague numbers, just so you know. How many? There's a lot. And 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. So we have this image of these beasts, and then before it, above it and before all of it, is this throne. And this throne has a court. We see this court in Isaiah chapter 6. We see this court in Revelation chapter 4. There's a theme playing out here. And I looked because of the sound that the great words that the horn was speaking. The beast was killed, its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged. So this beast becomes completely destroyed in this vision. These beasts are sort of, you guys are tamed back to the zoo, if you will. They get to stick around. And then from there, I saw in the night visions, verse 13, and behold, the clouds of heaven, which is a sign of divine status, there came one like a son of man. These words almost echoing exactly Mark chapter 13, verse 26. So what Daniel gets is a vision of the cycle of empire, the defeat of the cycle of empire. And in that moment, he sees not only God the Father, but he sees the resurrected Christ, because he has come up And he came to the Ancient of Days, and he was presented before him. Matthew chapter 28, verse 18. Acts chapter 1. To him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom. What does he say in Matthew chapter 28? Behold, all authority in heaven and earth has been given unto me, that all peoples, nations, languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. Like the stone from the first vision, we have an eternal kingdom at work. And his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. We have the 4 phases, then we have these 4 beasts. Now, if you line up the beasts, if you try to go to that order, because here in a second, he'll say, because he looks and he says, he asks an angel, he's like, hey, can you help me out here? And he says, yeah, sure. These 4 beasts are 4 kings who shall rise out of the earth. That's what he tells me. He says, yeah, these kings represent, or these beasts represent different kings. So if the lion represents Nebuchadnezzar again, and there's all this kind of cool stuff that goes in, but really the first sort of world-conquering superpower, which would line up with the leopard, was Greece under Alexander the Great. I mean, you're talking basically from Greece all the way to India, into North Africa. I mean, that was a world-spanning empire of the time. So people try to interpret that and see this. But here's the critical thing about verse 17. These 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth. And then look at what he says in verse 18. Look at what the angel says. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever and ever. Even the angel gets it. The angel is not, he's like, no, these beasts represent mighty and powerful kings. But it's the saints who will have dominion one day. It's the saints who have authority. It's the children of the Most High God who are the ones that have eternal power. Because in the cycle of empire, empires rise and fall. But there is an eternal kingdom being built that will ultimately have all authority, all dominion, and will reinstate or will bring about peace and the reign of God. Which, by the way, go back 2 weeks to this covenant idea. I will be your God, and you will be my people, and we'll dwell together forever. Now let's talk a little bit about what these could mean, because someone's getting involved here. When I say cycle of empire, I mean exactly that. That one way of interpreting these passages and looking at them is that, yes, they have fixed moments in history where they mean one thing, but if you look at it, then they kind of rotate and come back up again. Like if you're a student of world history, you can usually find 3 or 4 consecutive patterns of kingdoms that always rise up, right? I mean, you go, let's take us. Let's say, okay, well, we're the United States. We are the power right now. Well, before us was England. Before England was France. Before France was Spain. There's a cycle of 4 kingdoms. Before Spain, you had Teutonic kingdoms, you had the Holy Roman Empire. You had the Holy Roman Empire transferring in. You had the Dark Ages. That's not even to mention the kingdoms of the Arabian Peninsula, kingdoms going on in Africa, the cycle of kingdoms in the Indian subcontinent. There are always these cycles of kingdoms that rise and fall and rise and fall. And what Daniel is saying is, Nebuchadnezzar, you're just one of those guys. You may be at the top of the heap, but there's a whole other graduating class coming behind you. It's kind of like when you go from being in the 9th grade, and you're like, oh, I'm a 9th grader. And then you go to high school, and you're like, oh, man, I'm a worm all over again. Like you just cycle, you cycle. But there's a cycle that builds up, builds up, builds up. But what he's saying is in each of these prophecies so far, there's a moment where the cycle becomes disrupted. Where the feet are dashed and disappeared. Where one of the beasts is killed and the cycle stops. And it's in that moment that we begin to see the ultimate realization of all of these things. He says, behold, I will make it known. Okay, so that's it. And it goes on to there. And he says this, there will be a 4th kingdom on earth, and it will be different from all the kingdoms. It shall devour the whole earth and trample it down and break it to pieces. Okay, what is now being introduced is there's this idea that there is now this other kingdom. This other kingdom that will rise out of the pieces. Now, when I say kingdom, it could mean government, it could mean economy, it could mean worldview. Does it mean a literal kingdom? I'll give you the best answer I can. I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know. I don't want to know. I mean, I kind of want to know, but I don't know. And I've heard it all, by the way. I mean, I've heard every possible version of this. So as Ray Farnell, who's with us today, he has this book with him. It's an old eschatological apocalyptic book from England. And it's talking about, the devastating new technology of submarines. And it's all worried about submarines and the evils of the arrival, the sign of the last day contained in jazz music. Like we make this stuff work for any age. Do you see what I'm saying? Can we just be honest with each other about that? Well, people say, well, we have to know. We can know-ish. We can see the patterns and say, do they fit? But one thing we'll get about when we talk about Jesus is that the patterns always fit until one day they just all line up. So I, as a believer, have to sit back and watch and wait and see what are the cycles that I pay attention to. Okay, the next vision is a ram and a goat. And this is the destiny of two future empires is put on display. It's a ram and it's a goat. And the goats fight each other. And the ram and the goats fight each other. And the goat's really weird because the goat's got an extra horn. It's like a unicorn goat, like a unigoat. I don't know what that is. That could be a thing, I don't know. Rams, big sign of power back in the day. In fact, in Babylon, generals used to carry, one of the generals used to carry a golden ram's head into battle. So this is very yes, powerful, powerful, powerful. And he literally says, when he asks for the interpretation of this vision, the angel says, the ram, that's the Persians, the Media Persians, and the goat is the Greeks. I mean, you can't, it says it in the Bible. I can't get more fast and loose with the interpretation. So he says this is the Medo-Persians. You're like, well, who are the Persians? Well, the Persians are the empire that came from modern day Iran. They're the bad guys in 300. That's the best I can do. There's a lot going on with that. Don't watch it. Okay, and you know the Greeks. We're all familiar with the Greeks. You've all seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding. They invented everything. Okay? Funny thing about the Greeks is they stole everything. Anyway, all right. Anyway, okay. So it just talks about the conflict that we'll have. But even in this, the great horn between his eyes is the first king. Verse 22 of chapter 8 is where I'm at. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose. So this horn breaks in this battle. This horn breaks, okay? And out of this horn, 4 horns grow. By the way, that's exactly what happened after Alexander the Great died. He divided the entire world up amongst 4 generals. One of those generals started what was called the Seleucid dynasty. And out of the Seleucid dynasty, those were the people that oversaw what would later become Palestine. And there is an inheritor of the Seleucid dynasty that we are being pointed towards. And I'll get there. Because it says this in verse 23, a king with a bold face who understands riddles shall arise. His power shall be great, not his own power. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the Prince of princes. He shall be broken, but by no human hand. And we have now, so we have a king that comes out of the 10 horns. We have a king that comes out of this little horn. I'll get there. There's so much to do. All right. 70 weeks. It's probably not weeks. That's about as good as I can go. I want to get to this last bit is why I'm going through this. God's plan is not immediate. This is the next thing. But will play out across the ages and the ages to come. If you read in chapter 9, there's this thing about 70 weeks and this time frame. And it's amazing. You can do this math, and depending on when you start the 70 weeks, there's sort of different theories. One theory is that's a literal 490 years because it says 70 weeks, but it really means 70 years. My question's always been then, why did we translate it weeks? Basically what it means is there is a cycle of completeness that's probably an arbitrary amount of time. So trying to figure it out may not be entirely helpful. But let me jump forward to chapter 11. There is a man to come. Daniel chapter 10 through 12 reminds us of this fact, that there is a type of ruler who will always attempt to defeat the plan of God. We have now been introduced in 2 different ways, and now a third, into some sort of ruler, a king of some kind, who isn't just there to get his own kingdom, that he is there to actively destroy and fight against the hidden kingdom of God. His sole reason for existence is to defeat the kingdom of God. And it says this, and there's all kinds of stuff, and I won't get into it. But essentially, it talks about all these things that we do. Where's it? Okay, let's jump all the way to 11:36. And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and he shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. There's a point where he is called, the phrase that's used for him is that he becomes what's called an abomination of desolation. That there is a king, there is a type. So if we have cycles of empire, we have types of empires that try to rule the world and are all cast down, then we also know that there is a type of ruler that doesn't just seek to rule the world, but seeks to defeat the kingdom of God. And we are introduced to someone who later on in our time together, we will start referring to as the Antichrist. And he's introduced here. What's fascinating is that not only is he introduced here in terms of his content and character, but we also know very vividly of the first person who could probably have, if you will, fit the bill. Because what you have with the Antichrist is this cycle of people. And it's one of the perfect examples of people who fulfill prophetic boxes pointing towards the ultimate realization of one who will literally, of the one to come. And almost universally, scholars would say that the first real type of the Antichrist is a ruler named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He named himself Epiphanes. You see it there in Greek. It literally means God manifest. He's a ruler from the Seleucid dynasty, so he comes out of one of the four horns, right? He comes out of the Greek horn that shatters, turns into four horns, and out of that one of those little horns, he would come out of, if you take those 10 beasts, those 10 horns, there's a little horn that comes up. He ruled the Seleucid Empire from 175 BC until his death in 164 BC. Let me read a few things about him. The pagan cult introduced into Jerusalem by Antiochus Epiphanes is generally recognized to involve the worship of Baal Shem, where it came several allusions, including the word Shem, which means to make desolate. So he called himself that. So there's a direct connection between this coded word of abomination of desolation, and then centuries later, because this is centuries later, this guy who comes up and almost uses that name. Daniel's portrayal of Antiochus as the little horn from the beasts of the sea is all the more scathing if its mythological overtones are fully recognized. The king was devoted to Zeus. So let me tell you a few things that he did. This is a quote from a historian named Diodorus. First, one of the things that he did is he sacrificed a great swine at the image of Moses. So he sacrificed a pig in the temple. And at the altar of God that stood in the outward court, and sprinkled them with the blood of a pig. As we all know, the pig being one of the most unclean animals. So Antiochus, as ruler, comes into Jerusalem. He wants people to worship him because he thinks he's Zeus come back to life. He literally calls himself the God manifest. I am a God on earth. So here's what I'm going to do. And remember, one of the biggest predictions about him consistently is that he will do things towards God that no one could ever think of doing. Nebuchadnezzar never really said anything about God. Cyrus actually honored the God of Yahweh and let people go. Leader after leader after leader just ignored Yahweh. This guy, Antiochus, said, I will defeat not just the Jews, I will defeat your God. He commanded likewise that the books which they were taught to hate all other nations be sprinkled with the broth made from swine flesh. He put out the lamp, called by them immortal. That's the menorah that sat in the temple, one of the lamps in the temple, which was supposed to burn eternally. He put it out. Lastly, he forced the high priests and the other Jews to eat swine flesh. He outlawed Jewish religious rites and traditions in the temple in Jerusalem and changed and actually installed in the temple in Jerusalem, he put a statue of Zeus in the temple. So if you ever wonder why the Jews of the New Testament are a little about the temple, like really devout Jews, if you pay attention, like the guys who eventually become Jesus' disciples, they're like, we're not too nuts about the temple. It's because the temple had been completely defiled by then. There's a book, some of you may be familiar with it. It's called the Apocrypha, or it's what's called the Apocrypha. It's these books in between the canon of the Bible. And one of them are the book of Maccabees. The book of Maccabees talks about Antiochus the Fourth's rule over Jerusalem and the revolts and the uprises that came out of their complete indignation for who he was. But there is a type. There is a man. There is a type of person that exists in the quest for human power that will always seek to dethrone God. And he won't just dethrone God. He will mock God. He will defile God. He will try and tear God down. It's one thing to be an emperor and think you're in charge. It's an entire thing. It's another thing entirely altogether to be the one who in your mind beats God. And what we have is this introduction, and Jesus will talk about him, Paul will talk about him, and John will talk about him. Now what's interesting is people always say, well, who's the Antichrist? And I always say, it's whoever you didn't vote for. That's typically the answer. Well, in a few weeks, we'll talk about all of these things because this is just the beginning image. This is just the beginning. We get a very robust and complete picture of whomever this person will ultimately be, but I would contend that we've seen bits and pieces of them throughout all of human history. But there's always people who manipulate God's people, who subject God's people, who defy God's people, who kind of butter God's people up and then turn on God's people, who will use God's people for their advantage and then try to cast God's people down. Those are always with us. Paul calls him the man of lawlessness later. And we have to be aware of this type of person. John says that there is a literal spirit of Antichrist that dwells through the ages. So in this saga of empire, in this cycle of greater to lesser to lesser to lesser to greater to lesser lesser, and then there's this hidden kingdom that will come down out of the heavens, out of the stars, out of the mountain, and will eventually crash them all down. There is this other current running in. And it can seem terrifying and it can seem frightening, but I want to read this. In the last verse of Daniel says this. The last few verses of Daniel says this. And from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, by the way, Antiochus said you cannot do sacrifices anymore. He took away all the religious rites. He took away everything. It's taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up. There shall be 1,290 days. There's all sorts of math you can do there. But listen what he says. It's going to take 1,290 days for him to be cast down. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at 1,335 days. What does that mean? He says, don't worry about the 1,290. You only have to make it 45 days more. In other words, blessed is he, and this is going to be a theme that starts building up. Blessed is he that makes it. Blessed is he that endures. Blessed is he that sees past. But go your way till the end, and you shall rest and stand in your allotted place at the end of days. What was the angel telling Daniel? He said, Daniel, this is going to last 1,290 days, figuratively, literally, we'll never know. Blessed is the one that makes it to 1335, but you, Daniel, go your way till the end. Rest in your allotted place at the end of days. What is he telling Daniel? He said, Daniel, go do what you're to do in the now. Daniel, there is a soon, there is a later coming. But Daniel, I want you to pay attention to the now. You have an allotted place in salvation history. You have an allotted place in the big grand story of God's kingdom. Go do that. Because if you get distracted, you won't even make it to 1290, let alone 1335. If you want to make it all the way, Daniel, go do what you're called to do now. And then you will find your place at the end of time. What a powerful message. I once heard another pastor put it this way. He said, Christians have the horrible habit of paying attention to the past and the future when we should be paying attention to the present and to eternity. I want to look past the future into eternity. I want to pay attention to what's going on in the now, and I want to make sure I'm ready for the later. The soon and the before, the angel is telling Daniel, you have nothing to do with any of this. And we worry and we fret about, is this coming up? Is this kingdom rising? Probably. Is this person emerging? There's always one emerging. What are we called to do? To be in our now moment. To do what we have been allotted to do at our place in history. And all of this other stuff is just to remind us what's coming, to remind us that these cycles occur, to be on the lookout for things that would distract us or tear us down, to avoid alliances with the strength and the power of humanity, and to always keep trusting on the hidden king and the hidden kingdom. Because he has already been enthroned in heaven. He has already been given all authority. And he said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, therefore go. You go do this too. And it starts with these passages right here. Why don't we go ahead and pray? God, thank you for who you are and what you do in our lives. We thank you for how much you love us. God, forgive me for not giving these last 3 blanks. I will do that now. Thank you, Lord. All right. The rule and power of humanity's empires are still under the sovereignty of God. Remember I talked about the cycle of empire? Those cycles of empire are always shackled and bounded by God's power. Those cycles of empire, if you go back and you read especially Isaiah, those of us who are in the Isaiah class, you'll know God's the one bringing empires up and casting them down anyway. So all of this is within the sovereignty of God. Human rulers will always stand against God's kingdom. Let me say this again. Human rulers will always stand against God's kingdom. One of the most dangerous things that the church can do is assume that a human ruler is looking out for them. Because there is nothing more corruptive than the pursuit, the gaining, and the preservation of power. And once people have it, they will do anything they can to keep it. And I'm just saying, I have seen it in my lifetime so many times where the church says, we will trust this person. We trust the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. That's who we trust. Anybody else is a sideshow. Let's never forget that. All right? The empires of humanity will always fall before the kingdom of God. That's why you don't trust the people. Isaiah says it best. Who is man that you would regard him? Is not his nostrils full of breath? We get obsessed thinking this guy's going to save us or this gal's going to save us or only if this person were here or this person. Look, they put on their pants one leg at a time unless they jump into their pants, in which I wouldn't trust them because that's weird. We don't pay attention to them. We have a king. His name is Jesus, and he gets our absolute trust. So those are our 3 conclusions for tonight. Now, amen. All right, go ahead and enjoy your discussion time. Thanks for being here tonight.